Shabbat Shalom. So, at this point, do B'nai Yisrael have a constitution? Well, what is a constitution? Well, what is a constitution in general? A set of principles? Institutions establishing how the organization, the community, the society, the government will be run, usually containing the institutions of who gets to make what decisions, what we affectionately call in America the checks and balances of power, legislature, executive, judicial, and most constitutions for the last couple hundred years have also included certain protections, certain rights or other limits upon which the government, or beyond which the government cannot act. This is a sort of standard definition. So, is the Torah our constitution? Well, kind of. Well, kind of. It definitely has the establishment of certain institutions, of the Kohanim, the Levi'im. We have representatives of both here still today, although you're maybe not quite doing exactly the same job as you would have done 2,000 years ago, but the institutions are still here. We definitely had the establishment, as we'll see later in Deuteronomy, of the sages, which also continue until this day to have a role in guiding the community and adjudicating the interpretation of the Torah and the embedded laws within it of how we should live. And it is still a constitution in the sense that it is inviolate. If somebody comes along, even a prophet who does wonders and miracles beyond belief and says, oh, by the way, apart from my magic tricks, I also want to let you know that God talked to me last night, and God says we no longer have an obligation to take care of the poor. All that stuff in the Torah that talks about tithing and supporting the poor, God changed his mind, it's scratched, we're not doing that anymore. What do we say to such a prophet? No, sorry, you're out. And in fact, if they persist in this sort of way, it's a capital offense. To claim that the Torah has been uprooted permanently, that God has changed his mind, is, well, in the Torah itself, explained as a violation of itself. It is a constitutional error, and one that carries very significant penalties. That particular one of that you can't change the Torah for another one is kind of the main reason that we're not all Christian or Muslim or anything else, because we've got the Torah we've got. And yes, we have lots of room for interpretation and application. We do not have any room for replacement. So, now that we have an idea of the Jewish constitution, we have an idea of what a constitution is, let's turn to Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, the modern established state from 1948 until the present day. Does it have a constitution? It does not. Why not? Because their Declaration of Independence, which was signed back in 1948, says, we're going to have a constitution. 75 years later, there's no constitution. That's a long delay in Jewish time, even by Jewish time standards. So why not? What happened to the constitutional impetus there in 48 and 49? They had the Declaration of Independence, which is sometimes referred to throughout Israeli politics, but it's not a constitution. So one reason, because there are multiple, was, it's just too hard. If we actually sit down and try to hammer out a constitution, then we are going to expose all of the internal conflicts within the Jewish state. And right now, in the midst of the war for independence and then the ongoing struggle against the incursions that happened constantly between 1948 all the way until, well, almost the modern times, it's just, don't open that can of worms. Of course, there was also the fact that they did elect a constitutional committee as one of the first acts of establishing the State of Israel, And that committee looked around and said, why don't we just go ahead and legislate rather than make a constitution? And that's our first Knesset. The first Knesset was elected to be a legislature and a constitutional committee, and they only did half their job. And of course, that was very convenient. If you happened to be in the labor government at the time, and for the next 40 years, having constitutions can be annoying. Having that framework that says no, well, as long as you trust convention and community standards to keep you on the rails, then who needs a constitution, right? Don't you trust me? I mean, what am I going to do? Take over? We don't need a constitution. It's fine, it's fine. And back in the day of early Israel, when anyone could walk up on Ben-Gurion's house and knock on the door and have a chat with him, maybe it sort of kind of was working. And it was pushed to the back burner. People did feel over the years that maybe something a little bit more concrete needed to be put into place, and Israel began a cycle of what they're called basic laws. Now, even though they're called basic laws, they're not technically a constitution, because to override a basic law takes an act of the Knesset. It's general legislation. Now, they set them up as we shouldn't tamper with these, and we should make sure that all future legislation adheres to these basic principles of governance, of rights, and such. But technically, if another Knesset wants to vote in their majority to get rid of them, there's nothing to stop them. After all, there's no constitution to prevent that from happening. And one of these, the one that is in particular in the spotlight just this week, was the idea that the High Court of Israel would not only adjudicate according to these basic laws and other principles of justice, whether or not the behavior of the government was correct. Remember, we can't call it constitutional because there is no constitution. But one of the principles that was added to the mix was that there needed to be a certain reasonableness for the government's behavior. That if people challenged the government's decisions on the fact that it had no reasonable claim to make that decision or no reasonable right to administer in that area of life, that the High Court could weigh in and say, you're right, the government is overreaching here, and they shouldn't be allowed to do that, or no, this is perfectly normal governance, and of course the government gets to do these things. For the last 30 weeks, and I went back and checked, we talked about this in March, there have been protests in Israel the likes of which have never been seen. These are not protests about peace, about land for peace, or about the Palestinian issue, or about the existential crisis of Iranian nuclear weapons. These are protests by Israeli citizens about the Israeli government and what it is doing to Israeli citizens' apprehension for the future democracy of Israel. Because what the government has proposed in total was to undo the reasonableness clause, that no one should be allowed to tell the government that their decisions are unreasonable, because after all, they're the government. Who are you to tell me I'm unreasonable? And additionally, they want to change the composition of the High Court so that it will be appointed by a majority of Knesset, meaning that there is no one to tell them not to put such and such a person on the High Court. And they also want to make it that if the High Court says that even some of the other basic laws, not even the reasonableness, but like the rights that Israel has voted for itself, are violated by a government policy, that the Knesset can override the High Court decision by a simple majority vote. Which, of course, if the legislation passed in the first case, it was a majority vote to pass it. So obviously, anything the High Court would try to strike down as a violation of the basic laws of Israel would not be upheld. It would be overruled by the same people who sent it to the High Court in the first place. Can you see why the Israelis are advocating for change? That they don't want these policies to be put through. There is a consensus that Israel probably does need a constitution, and it's maybe about 75 years late to the game here. But there's a feeling that there needs to be a constitution, but this is not it. And this is not the solution to the tension between the Knesset and the High Court and who gets to make the final decisions on different points. There is a rightful discussion to be had And indeed, when the protests began with hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets and plazas around the country, that was what they were advocating for. Look, just stop and let's actually have a proper conversation about what the governance of Israel should look like long term, what a constitution should should come into being as. The current administration paused when they saw hundreds of thousands of people and their poll numbers. They paused in trying to implement this. And now they have decided to do it again, but this time, rather than putting the whole package on the table, they are going to put one piece at a time on the table. The first piece that's up for the chopping block tomorrow or Monday is the reasonableness clause, that the High Court would have any jurisdiction to adjudicate over the reasonableness of the government's power in any given field. We are basically tomorrow or Monday, maybe Tuesday, maybe they're waiting for Tisha B'Av just for the irony, looking to make the vote happen this week. And there are, again, thousands and thousands of Israelis who have taken, even over Shabbat, I've understood, to protest this. And it's unclear what's going to happen. At the moment, it looks like what's going to happen is the vote will pass, and that portion of the basic laws will be deleted. In addition to the classical take to the streets blocking freeway protests, I believe the last I saw, more than 1,000 of the reservist pilots in Israel have said they will no longer do their voluntary service. The mandated legal one, they're not yet willing to say they won't show up for that, but the voluntary service that they do, they have said they will not do if this, currently, and will not resume if this goes through as legislation. Well, all of it is serious. But yes, if you need to make it more serious, and indeed some people within, including the Minister of the Defense, have said we need to pause this in order to reconcile this issue. Of course, they also released a tentative ad blaming these reservists for the future deaths of Israeli soldiers, saying, you know, I won't help you because you're on the wrong side of the political spectrum, which also doesn't play very well. But yes, this is a fundamental crisis in Israel, and it is one entirely of our making. The crises that Israel has faced in the past, the external wars for her survival, were very clear of what we needed to do. Israel needed to survive, Israel needed to defend herself, Israel had a right to prosecute those that were prosecuting her in war, and when it shifted from being conventional war to being terrorism, Israel had every right to continue to act that way. And Israelis would protest in support of those needs. And they might protest of the need to pursue a bit more aggressively a peace policy while maintaining safety and security. But by and large, there was unanimity on this topic. Different degrees of discussion. This is the most protested thing ever in Israeli history. You have not seen this many people take to the streets. You have not seen both business leader organizations as well as labor leader organizations on the same side of the picket line saying this should not happen. You have not seen university professors and students boycotting their studies while this is underway. You have not seen people from every walk of life, whether they be Muslim, Christian, or Jew, Israeli citizens all on the same side. And a very small minority saying, no, we need to continue to push this through. So why is this being pushed through? Well, there's the immediate reason, which is coalition governments in Israel. By the way, that's usually the answer to jeopardy. Anytime you've got a question of why is Israel doing something that seems really strange, the surface answer is always going to be a coalition partner has demanded this in order for them to continue to vote for whoever's currently prime minister to stay as prime minister. And indeed, this is part of the current system, because the High Court has struck down numerous things the government has tried to do, which have been preferential to certain elements of the Israeli society, whether they be the religious Zionists, whether they be the ultra-Orthodox. And the High Court keeps saying, look, our basic laws say you cannot play favorites like this. Well, they would like to play favorites, thank you very much. By the way, that means that those of us here in this room, conservative Jews, yes, we would be second-class citizens if the High Court is not there to protect. We're already in many ways second-class citizens, even with their protections, but it would be even worse. But more generally, there is a feeling among a small part of Israeli society that Israel has tried democracy, and it hasn't been good enough. That Israel has had too much democracy, too much freedom, too much listening to those that are worried about rights, worried about the freedoms of others that may or may not even be our true friends, those that are different than us, worried about limitations on where we can and can't live in land that we should rightly be settling in their opinions. And they recognize that the High Court and the principles that are currently enshrined in the basic laws are obstacles to what they would like to do for the country. And so this is a necessary step for them to pursue their legislation. But recognize that as a necessary step to pursue their legislation, they are also opening the door to their opponents doing exactly the same when they take power. That is to say, if Israel remains a democracy, those who currently are pushing for the removal of any judicial oversight, the removal of any adherence to the basic laws, and for the creation of a high court that will be entirely beholden to the current Knesset, which will be able to override it at its whim, that their political opponents will have that exact same power if they come to office. Can you imagine a political group that wants their political opponents to be given that power? Which means, what is the underlying intention? That they don't get that power. That steps will be taken, to use my best passive voice, to ensure that the wrong people don't get power. Meaning people who disagree with the agenda of the current administration. There is no fundamental logic between opening up a Pandora's box of allowing a government to throw aside all conventions and legal limits to its behavior if you expect to ever share power with your political opponents again. Because after all, they will simply step in and they will undo everything you did. Because you just gave them the keys to the treasury that allows them to undo everything you just did. You just told them there is no limit. You can adjudicate whatever you want. That you don't have to worry about the basic laws, you don't have to worry about the conventions of governance that have been in Israel for 75 years. Do as you wish. That's what we're doing. When it's your turn, you can do as you wish. No one would logically say that to their political opponents. Govern the country as you wish without limit when it's your turn. Instead, it means there will not be your turn. This is why there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting. This is why it is a severe crisis which is concerning to governments around the world that are allies and friends to Israel, including our own. This is why this topic should be at the heart of your news consumption over the coming week, and depending upon the outcome, the coming weeks. It is why this Tisha B'Av, when we commemorate the destructions that have befallen our people because of sinat chinam, because of baseless hatred, because of factionalism, which literally led to the violent attacks one against each other, Jew against Jew, for the right to force others to be their kind of Jew. We need to be conscious of this more than ever. In an instant, the democracy that is so precious to us in Israel, the jewel of Israel as the promise of redemption, could be stolen from us. Not by an Arab army, not by an Iranian missile, but by us. Shabbat Shalom.